We are here today to talk about sales automation. My name is Audrey Strom, and I'm a community manager at Outreach. And just thank you. Thank you so much for joining. And we've got three stellar operations leaders here to share their approach to automation, as well as how they've adopted an automation first mindset and how that's really fundamentally changed their approach to sales operations. So the three leaders are Hal Luang from Tray.io, Jamie Caldwell from Reddit, and Katherine Watkins from 6sense. Before I have these three introduce themselves, I did want to make a quick note about Q&A. You guys are already doing a great job using that chat functionality. That is where I will be monitoring and watching for questions. So in addition to having 10 minutes of Q&A at the end of our time together, this goes through the hour. So we'll have that 10 minutes of dedicated Q&A. And the panelists have agreed to let me field some questions in real time. So don't be shy. Send your questions in. Worst case scenario, if the three of these folks really get the ball rolling, and there's no appropriate time for me to interject with your questions, we'll hold it off to the end and spend some time together then. So now we all know what to expect. Let's go ahead and dive in. And I'm going to have us start with some introductions, just round robin style. Jamie, why don't you kick us off? Go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us about your role, your company, any information you think would be relevant for our attendees here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Audrey. And it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Jamie Caldwell. I'm the sales and marketing infrastructure manager at Reddit. And I began in an operations role, owning sales systems and tools from an ops mindset from the beginning, and have carved out some new space that I'm looking forward to diving in as we talk about automation first with you today. I've worked across order management, operations. I've worked as a business partner. I've worked on engineering teams as we think about how to actually build these solutions as well. I'm looking forward to sharing some of that journey with you and the practices along the way as we think about driving automation first here at Reddit.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katherine Watkins, and I'm Director of Revenue Operations here at 6sense. One of the important things to me of just the difference between revenue operations and sales operations is really where we're combining all of the different revenue teams and going into operating them all as one. So having both the sales, marketing, and customer success all blended together to give that full all-up vision of revenue operations. I'm really excited here to talk about all the different ways that we've gone around on doing automation first and looking at processes and policies and how can we use our systems and tools to our best advantage.
Hey everyone, I'm Hal Luang. I lead sales strategy and operations here at Tray. It's a unique position because at Tray, we build an automation tool for operations folks like myself, and I'm using it in a very meta way and building a lot of automation, helping to build process that makes automation worth automating. And the traditional sales operational stuff, we built a CPQ on Tray. We've helped automate a lot of our process using Salesforce and Slack and Tray. And anyways, it's an interesting role to be able to use Tray internally at a company that sells Tray.
I love it. I resonate with that very much as somebody who's keen and excited to use Outreach as an Outreach employee. It's always fun. One thing that I find really compelling about all of these panelists we have here today is that even though we're all kind of doing similar work and the roles that we have are all very kind of interrelated, they're very distinct. We've got sales ops, sales and marketing infrastructure, rev ops, right? I think the best panels and the best discussions are where we have a pretty simple question or simple but loaded question, and then everybody kind of adopts slightly different angles. So let's test that. A simple but loaded question that's probably going to come up with a lot of different answers, right? What does RevOps mean to you?
I can start.
Oh, go ahead, Hal.
Yeah, I can start. So I am just, as I mentioned, I just do sales operations, and having had a past role in revenue operations, it's really interesting to be able to compare and contrast. And for me at this company, what it means is just we have a strong partnership with the marketing ops team. So pros and cons there, but it's to say that for us at Trey, RevOps is really just a partnership at this point, and it's a Slack channel that we all contribute to and have conversations. We meet weekly or bi-weekly, and we work closely with the other team. I'll pass it off to you, Catherine, who's doing a true RevOps role.
Yeah, so when I think about revenue operations, I think about the customer experience, and really where you're bringing in those prospects from the marketing lens, and then you're taking them through that entire experience of from the operations standpoint. You're thinking about that customer experience, and that's driving what kind of operations that you're going to be doing, and making sure that we're not catering towards just sales or just marketing, but we're really focusing on the customer and thinking about what kind of revenue streams that are going to be generated by that customer, because the sale is the first step in that revenue and that land, and then that continue to expand when we're looking at SaaS models. And so really thinking about it from that full funnel view of operations, to really make sure that you're building an infrastructure for that customer experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I resonate with both what you're both saying here. And that's one, it's a coalition of people, and that's similar to how we operate today. And I think we're constantly revisiting that. When you think about the way you've just described revenue operations, Catherine, it's about that end-to-end journey, from the moment that we ideate that a customer might want to buy from us, and how do we get that to the right teams internally to then action on. And once we sell that dollar, how are we growing it, retaining it, keeping it? And then, in my role also, I'm watching that dollar transition out of that operation piece, and how do we actually recognize that revenue and report on it accurately as well. So really thinking about, it's almost the journey of a potential dollar to the moment we can call it a dollar of ours. And it does encompass that entire umbrella of customer success, marketing, really needing each of these teams to be working together in order to have a solid revenue operation strategy. I think you defined it really well, Catherine. That's exactly how I think about it. And I think that's how we try to think about solving the problems together as well.
And I think the other piece that's really important too is while there is that common string of the customer experience, there are functions that are specific to each one of those core teams. So something that might not be relevant, let's say, to marketing from the customer success side, that CS operations can really own that and drive that, but really have that ability and that voice to connect that dot back to have that full loop, I think is really important. And when we have these different operations siloed, sometimes that gets lost, and then there's not a great experience for that customer to have. And I love your thoughts about the potential dollar, because there's so much that's underneath that we don't see until you get that customer and they continue to utilize the product and you continue to understand more about who your customer is and what they're doing with the product.
Yeah, and I would reiterate, I feel like one of the things you brought up that really stuck out to me is this idea of a cycle, right? And I think too often especially from a sales and marketing perspective, we think of it more as a funnel, and it kind of seems like one directional, whereas the revenue operations model really makes you start thinking of it as more of a cycle as opposed to a one-way direction. And I think that's an important aspect to be thinking about as it matures beyond just that initial new business sale, and it's really bringing in customer success and thinking of it as a revenue cycle as opposed to a funnel.
Yeah, some really good perspectives there, and it makes me think about something that I first mentioned when I introduced this panel discussion: an automation first mindset. We've got all of these different teams and so many different processes what's the role of automation when it comes to rev ops and kind of getting these processes right?
I'll tackle this one first. I think from my seat, revenue is not only about a sale, but how effectively are we making that sale? And where we have manual processes, reducing the time a seller, for example, or various team members in that journey can be spending their time. If we bring in automation to those manual tasks, actually can help us reduce our cost per person, reduce our cost per sale and increase our productivity per person. So in not only thinking about how to get to retain, grow a dollar, also how effective are we being in doing that dollar and getting that dollar? And especially when you're in a hyper growth phase, it's really important to kind of do this dance of where do we bring effectiveness to our sales teams while also building a foundation for scale. And so I tend to lean towards those dollars as I think about an automation first mindset. What can we automate that will save us money as well as bring us more money?
I think the part where you hit is just kind of the working smarter, not harder, and where there's a lot of aspects of revenue operations, of sales operations, of areas that we can look at creating processes that will then you can take on the automation with it so that you aren't having to do everything manually. And then you can spend your time and focus on the things where you're going to need that human touch for. You're going to need to have those conversations. You're going to need to have the interaction. There's so much that you can get done within a day and have your tools work for you, and then go and do those hard things. And also utilize it as reminders. We work with a lot of, we're working so fast, and we sometimes forget that we need to transfer that information unless we have that ping of saying, hey, did you remember to fill out this, or did you remember to do these things? And then that information then continues to get memorialized, and people can continue to use it throughout that revenue journey.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the part that resonates with me is the idea of helping individuals kind of reduce some of the things that are more manual and not as interesting parts of their days. One of the things I try to think about is with AEs, I think it's easy to attribute a quota and a dollar amount that they can bring to the table. And I'd like to at least think aspirationally with an operations team, it's more that multiplier effect in terms of like, well, if they're able to bring this much dollars, how can we as operational experts be able to add a multiplier effect where if everyone's working 5% smarter and 5% more effectively, can we increase that quota by 5% and be able to add that kind of X factor to the table? So it's one of those things. It's an aspirational hope, and I think it's something that it would be really interesting to be able to unlock as a way to be able to see very direct value that automation can bring to the table. And then I think it just there's a part of me that for some reason this mantra came to mind that as we were talking about creating automation, I think of someone once told me when I was a kid that give a lazy man a job and he'll find an easier way to do it. I kind of think of myself as that sometimes, where it's like, there's got to be an easier way to do this, right? There's got to be some automation here that can just make this easier. And I think that in a lot of the traditional go-to-market playbook, there's a lot of room for that.
Just to how multipliers, that is a word that we use all the time when thinking about our team is being multipliers with automation. I think that was a great word choice there. I actually wrote that same thing down when thinking about automation first strategy is just that. How can we multiply our value? And it also, as we seek to get resourcing and help to drive an automation first strategy, I think that is a key way to get that accomplished, is by really showing how we can multiply the value of what we do. Yeah.
I definitely agree with you guys, and the fact that we always think about, like how the sales teams and customer facing teams, how can they become more multipliers, where you see these teams grow substantially, and then you look at your operations team, and it's like, okay, we're growing these teams huge, but there's still the same amount of people on the operations side. So it's like, how are you going to get so much stuff done without having more bodies? And so being able to use automation in your favor to become a multiplier of within your own team.
Yeah, it was fun to watch everybody's eyes light up when Hal said that idea of being a multiplier. Both Jamie and Catherine were just really excited by that. And I also wrote it down because I thought it was fantastic. Thanks for that. And great analogy too. Catherine, last time we spoke, something that really stood out to me that you said around an automation first mindset and kind of an automation strategy was the following: automation strategy is only as good as your process. Can you expand on that a little bit? Maybe explain what you meant by that?
Yeah. So automation is great. And I think that it sometimes is a double-edged sword, in the fact that if you try to automate something that hasn't been fully thought of, and then you continue to layer on top of that, you're going to have a Band-Aid effect. And then, people come and go, and then you try to fix something, or you try to make a change in it, and then everything falls apart. And then everyone's looking back at the operations team like, oh no, what happened? We need to fix this immediately. And then it takes even more time. So really understanding what is the process, or what are the outcomes you're looking to achieve with that process, and then looking at to automate it, and making sure that you have that buy-in from who's asking for it. And sometimes people ask, we've become a very big society on just, like being able to automate things. Like people use that as a very quick thing, like, oh, can we just automate this because it'll be fast? And it's like, well, what exactly are you trying to automate here? And really kind of doing that deeper, that double click, and understanding like what is that sales leader asking you really actually to do? And by automating X, Y, and Z, is it really going to accomplish what they're going to look for? And is that information going to help move the dot, give them that benchmark, or being able to use that data set in order to make informed decisions? And so looking at that full process, and then being able to then say, okay, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and we're going to go implement it. And then, things as the world changes so quickly, then go in and then say, hey, we need to iterate on this. And we have this process. This is how we've structured it. And this is what we're going to iterate it because we've evolved. And so being able to have that, crawl, walk, run kind of mentality about the automation and about your processes allows you to actually work faster later down the road, especially from the operations standpoint. And it allows you from a historical standpoint to then go back and be able to help your team and help the organization understand why you did these things in a certain way.
Yeah, and I'd add to that in that I've been brought in a couple of times just by the nature of our product and what we sell and the types of customers that we have. Been brought in as a subject matter expert in terms of helping talk through process. And I think one of the taglines I love is create process that's worth automating, right? And I think there's a lot of times where people think very quickly to just automate what we have, and like, let's just use Tray and see value pretty quickly. And I've seen customers then also think really intently about their process and about the automation. And it's a problem just to see where the automation wasn't built well. Excuse me. where the automation wasn't built well and the process wasn't really a great process, that it's just kind of you're layering on top of it and you're making it harder to unwind later, which is to say that it's, I think to Catherine's point, first thing is just think about what is the process, what are you trying to achieve, and is this the way that you want people to be like operating and doing their jobs before we even start talking about how do we make it faster, quicker, and more efficient.
Yeah, agree with absolutely everything you both said. I won't repeat any of it. The one thing I want to come back to, Catherine, that you said was around this idea of sometimes the concept of just automate it and make my lives easier. And that comes to us very frequently in different channels. And I think something really key there too, in defining good process and policy and then being able to automate it, is also really getting to the core of what is the problem we're solving for? Because quite frequently, right, a request will come our direction that is an ask to automate something. And it's actually the something that they want us to automate is maybe a different root problem that we could solve and at a much bigger scale as we evolve, right? And so the one thing I just want to add is really identifying that problem has been key to also being able to set up a successful process or policy that will enable that automation first mindset.
Jamie, one of the biggest questions that I always ask is just, or it's not even a question, but it's like, tell me more, because you want to hear more about, you get thrown this like concept or this big thing. And it's like, well, tell me more about what you're trying to say or actually saying. And sometimes that actually stops people to think about, well, what am I asking for? And then then you don't hear from them for a couple days or something, or the time elapses and then, or it just kind of goes away. And that kind of helps you also weed out that is this something that I need to do right now when it was urgent, when it first came in, and then versus, oh, this person's really thought about this and really, really needs to solve that a critical problem at that moment.
I'd love to hear, Catherine, maybe if you wanted to expand on that example that you were just mentioning, or maybe think about another time when you had a successful, implementation of one of those business problems that was automated. Or maybe even on the flip side, can you tell us about a specific time when somebody did come in, what that specific problem was, and how you kind of, with that, tell me more, or other sorts of scripts, like how you walked them through making a better decision around their automation?
Yeah, one of the areas that we faced that we had issues were that source of truth question. For a lot of areas, a lot of people look to Salesforce type of thing. So one of the issues that we came across from a sales operations, and then it branched out into more of a revenue operations request, was the single source of truth for people. And when you get new hires, when you have people that transfer, when you have people that exit the business, and how do you make sure that your systems are all up to date? Because that's going to feed multiple things. So at Outreach, when I was there, we utilized ADP for our system of record for people. However, that didn't transfer directly into our Salesforce instance. And so we had a number of dashboards or a number of reporting areas where things didn't automatically get routed properly because people weren't aligned to the right managers or the right roles. And so we utilized Trey for it to talk from our ADP through our Okta and then into our Salesforce for us to be able to identify when we had sales teams, either new hires, people that exit, or people that are transferring to different areas of the business, and being able to identify when those things happened and have it actually feed into our Salesforce. So then our reporting then became cleaner. We didn't have our sales managers coming up to us and asking us, why isn't this person here? Where did this person happen? And it was because there was a ticket that someone had logged and it just hadn't been taken care of. And then expanding that into our customer success team, our professional services, and our solutions consultants, where a lot of companies have internal transfers and those don't get sorted out as quickly as possible. Having it be automated through utilizing Trey and then utilizing it through all of our different areas, it really allowed us to not have to think about every single time that those happened. And then there was just more of educations that we had to deal with rather than having to do it manually through a ticketing system.
Oh, that's great. And Astra from our chat here, Q&A, asked any other specific examples of successful automation of a process would be something that would be super helpful. Anything come to mind for you, Jamie or Hal?
I know that one of the things that came to mind, and I think is piggybacking off of like the tell me more. I think one of the wonderful things about when we start to talk about automation is that it does bring in the conversation of like talking about more in regards to like an example I can think of is in designing your lead routing solution, right? And I think in that process, there's a lot of, I think people think it's pretty simple, right? It's like I got leads come in, just sign it to some AEs and call it a day, right? Send it to the right people in the right geo, and then you start to layer in some of those requirements. And I think what I love about the automation conversation is that you start to ask the right questions in that. So an example might be like, well, what about if they're already in an opportunity today, or what if they're current customers, or what if they're partners? And I think that's part of the tell me more type of thread. So lead routing is another one that I think about where stakeholders just say, hey, just send it to the right place and it'll be good. And it really generally has a much longer conversation. I think folks that are in the operations world can commiserate and / have their own war stories and nightmares about it.
Yeah, two examples come to mind that we're working on and have just recently worked on. One is really automating some of the workload between NetSuite and Salesforce using Tray, for example, in order to first we had to establish which was going to be the source of truth for us from a customer database perspective. And once we made that decision, then we were able to start automating customer creation in the other system and taking a bi-directional approach when updates are made in either system. And going through that journey, it sounds really simple. Create a customer in Salesforce, therefore I create one in NetSuite. So many questions. Once they become a paying customer, how soon do we want to have them in that system? If the address is changed through a customer reaching out to our billing and accounting teams and that change is made in NetSuite, will we make that change in Salesforce? And vice versa. In Salesforce, do we allow sellers to change the address? We had a lot of lacking process and policy around this particular topic. So as we were defining automation, we were also defining some of that process and policy. And I think those questions can get really tricky to answer there. We saved a large amount of time for our billing motion by doing that, by having these customers created. They were creating net new customers every 30 days as we were going through our revenue cycles. So it's been really great to have that time back for the team. And then another one is that lead flow is another area we're tackling, but we also have custom ownership on our objects in our Salesforce to handle ownership of accounts and revenue over teams, time, and role. So in ways that Salesforce hasn't always been really great at going that deep, it's actually getting much better. But in the interim, we've built something on top. And a lot of this was manually managed by the operations teams. They were spending roughly anywhere from 12 to 30 hours at every transition to make sure all of the updates were right across all of the various objects and that it was handled appropriately across time and duration. And so being able to automate that motion for them also saved a valuable amount of time as we're handling quarter transitions. They're loading in one place, we're moving on, all of our revenue reporting is correct. Whereas in the past, we've spent weeks reviewing, auditing, making sure that everything was as expected as we gathered from Google Sheets all over the place. So automating that ownership has really just saved us a ton of time.
And I think one of the other areas of automation that's been critical, especially as you look at thinking about becoming a public company, for example, and the fact that approval processing, when you're looking at quoting and when you're looking at being able to provide an audit trail of discounting and to the same extent, how, to your point with like lead distribution of like, what happens if someone's out or what happens if someone leaves? You know, you had that same question of like, who's gonna approve this if, you know, if a manager goes on vacation or if, you know, somebody on the deal desk is gone, you know, like who's going to do that? And so really thinking about the process and thinking about all of the different like decision trees that you're going to get to be able to then map it out and then to be able to implement it. You know, utilizing which tools are going to be best for it. You know, if you have simple things, can you utilize Salesforce for you know, some of that simple automation, or will you have to go through more advanced workflows to be able to get that? I think that's also another important aspect of time, because I think that not only is it time for building it, but also from the end user, not wanting to wait for something to fire and then like saving the page takes 30 seconds because it's having all this background automation that's firing, because that can be very disruptive to the end user's perspective as well.
A common pain point that we had all discussed was that a lot of these different processes live in different parts of the org across different teams, right? So how do you get all of these different teams with different automation processes on the same page? What does that look like? And can you maybe tell us about a time when you did get everybody on the same page and kind of wrangled all of these different processes or systems? And yes, I just used the word wrangle, so you're welcome.
I can speak a little bit to, oh, sorry, Jane, were you going to say something? All right. I can speak a little bit. I think for most companies, you can probably understand that you probably have one of the messiest tray implementations, in the sense that like we have the oldest one and we've got a lot of users, and we try to practice what we preach. And so that was definitely something to wrangle on our end too. So one of the things that we ended up doing is we created an org that is specifically called RevOps, even though, as I mentioned before, there's not technically a RevOps team. And then that has just been this coalition of users that are building automation within one org. And then in that, it just comes back to having more regular touch points in terms of sharing the interesting workflows that we've done. And a specific example that might sound small, but we were running into a rate limit issue with the Slack API. In the situations that we want to send a Slack message, we want to know who to @mention, right? And in the scenario where there's maybe a lot of messages going out, we hit this rate limit error. And all I have to say is that we were all tapping into a very similar function of like, give me that Slack user's ID so that I can @mention them in my automation. And that was something that we collectively all experienced, and we all essentially found a solution to it where we would just pull all the data once a day and put it into in trade terms, a storage helper, which is just something that we can all universally tap into. And that really helped. That was a kind of a cross-functional solution that all of us were having the same issues with this rate limit. And instead we were able to use one common solution to avoid hitting the Slack API so many times in a day. Instead, it was once a day, and we all just would tap into that one service that we created.
One question that just came in through the chat that I think is pretty interesting. This is from Sander. Thinking of decision trees and mapping out processes, maybe even processes across different teams. How do you do this yourselves? Do you do pen and paper or whiteboard? How do you actually facilitate that that decision tree process? I think that was you, Catherine, right?
Yeah, I like to whiteboard things. I also like to think out the story. Like I think like if I'm just typing it out, like I type out the bullets, I type out what I'm trying to actually accomplish. And then I think about what that decision tree is looking at. I like using lucidchart or any kind of decision Visio, any of those types of flow chart applications to be able to then look at it. And then And then I share both the story, the long story that I've written out, plus that decision tree, plus, the different scenarios of what I'm trying to accomplish. And I usually take it to somebody that's way smarter than me, like my developer, and be like, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. Let's walk through it. And chances are 99% of the time there's a situation that comes up and it's like, have you thought about this? And I'm like, no, I haven't thought about that. That's a really great idea. And so really collaborating with both people from the business as well as from more of that data perspective, because everybody sees things a little bit differently. And so when you're able to work also as well as with your business partners too. So like if you're working with your sales leader, your CS lead, and of what they're trying to automate, and, making sure that you guys agree, and then bringing it to your dev and making sure that they understand what you're what the business is trying to accomplish. And then they can help you from that decision piece, because I find that once they get actually into the automation, there's a lot more like yes and no's and decisions that have to be made that I haven't necessarily thought of as a business. So getting that as like a double check, and then making sure that you take that back to your business partner saying, okay, these are the other things that we thought about, making sure that they agree, and then go into that execution. And even though it seems like it's a longer process, it also builds that documentation for you that then you can add and you can store with the actual code, or however you're going to the actual background piece that doesn't speak English to me, bringing those pieces together. And so then you kind of basically build out that content and documentation for your records, as if you need to look back in 5 months later and you need to make a tweak, well, then you have that. So it kind of builds that dictionary as well.
Yeah. Awesome. I start at whiteboards too. Right behind this curtain here, I have a whiteboard as well. I can't get away from it. Even going home, I ordered the largest whiteboard possible. And then once I've put it on a whiteboard and we start beating it around a little bit as a team, we start transitioning over to the lucidchart, where we document like our processes. And the reason why is because once you start putting it in a system where people are connecting boxes and lines, suddenly it gets a lot more serious and rigid, right? A whiteboard, there's so much flexibility in grabbing the eraser and, oh yeah, and we won't forget this thing. Once you're sort of hard coding your process in a image in lucidchart, that's where I think the rubber really meets the road in finding those areas where your automation will fail you. And also, if you just started with your process and not even setting out to solve it, pick a topic in your revenue ops world that you're trying to solve for and map it out and get it on this paper. You will find areas of opportunity for low-hanging fruit for automation to just save time. You can quickly identify them. And then you also have almost like a backlog of work to do without having really identified many problems, because you've written out your process, and you will you'll instantly find opportunities to succeed there. One thing I want to circle back on really quick was this question, Audrey, around, how do you get buy-in? Actually documenting your process in a lucidchart is a great way. If your process charts go, across an entire conference room, an imaginary conference room, you're not going to have a lot of challenge getting buy-in to solve those problems, right? So that's one good thing. The other thing is, I think, specifically here at Reddit, as we've gone through this hyper growth journey we're on, oftentimes back to the problem is not identified correctly. If we can show the value of the return of investment for automation, so that's what I do. We go on what I'll call a roadshow across all of the stakeholders whom we need their sponsorship, their buy-in, or alignment to solve a problem. Or maybe we need them to rewrite a process or policy that we think is out of my scope to define, for example. It's really about going around with a clear problem statement, a clear idea on what kind of return of value we think we can get by doing the work. And I find that those numbers and accompanied with the problem statement, we are able to get that buy-in cross-functionally. If we can show what we're going to gain by doing the work and by automating something, I think it almost becomes a no-brainer for everyone around the business to say, yeah, we should save that time and money and I don't have something else that we'd like to work on that will save us more time or money. And it gives us a great framework to prioritize how we work as well, and then a lens by which to get that buy-in across all of the teams.
Yeah,
That's great. Yeah, go ahead, Hal.
I was going to say, yeah, and one thing I would add too is I'm embarrassed to say I really like PowerPoint decks and like Google Slides. I think it's a really nice way to help also like control the narrative in terms of like what you want to talk about. Because I agree, I think lucidcharts, Visios, and all, and I also was, I'll throw in there too, I really miss whiteboarding. I really miss whiteboarding with colleagues in the office, and I got to do it once when me and a couple other folks went to the office in early July. And anyways, I don't have a whiteboard in my office, but I do miss it. But I think those are all important pieces. And then you take the whiteboard, you put it into a documentation in Visio or lucidchart, then you'd be able to like have a more holistic view of it. And then one thing on what I like to do personally is take screenshots of that process flow, and then I put it into Google Slides to be able to start having that conversation where it's contextually relevant, of where like, hey, don't look at the other parts of the document, just look at this one thing that I'm showing on the screen, and then have a link to the larger document. That I found to be really effective. And on top of that, taking it another step forward and creating wireframes so that they can understand what that day in the life would look like. So, if it's like a approval workflow that you're kind of trying to go through and say, well, this is like the way you would be presented with this approval. This is the type of information you would see on it. This would be the ideally enough information for you to create your approval, and it'll happen in Slack or wherever. And then be able to provide a visual like that is really helpful too, to supplement on top of the process flow.
Hal, I love that, the wireframe. I think, when you're talking to leaders, like you can imagine what it's going to look like in Salesforce or in whatever, tool, like you're going to see it, you know what it's going to look like, but they haven't spent that much time in it, so that they don't know what it looks like. And so being able to show them that proof of concept of what it's going to look like for their end users and what they're actually going to do helps it resonate with them to be like, yeah, this is a really great idea. Or like, hey, there's this, I don't like this one little piece, and let's kind of like look at how we can iterate on it. I think that's awesome. And then the other thing I wanted to point out too, that I think is super important, is having, I like to call it the parking lot, or the what's out of scope. Like, as much as the things like, like when you do start to brainstorm, when you do start to like collaborate on these things, there's a lot of really great things that, sometimes we want to boil the ocean or solve every single problem, but we won't be able to do that. And we will kind of derail what the actual root problem is that we're trying to solve. So as long as we have a place that we can say, hey, you know what, well, that's a really great thing that we're going to want to look at. That's kind of a side rail. That's something that we're going to want to table for another discussion, because it's going to derail us from what the point is and the problem that we're trying to go solve, which, to Jamie, your point of having that problem statement is key to knowing like what you are going to solve.
Jenny earlier asked a question around buy-in, and I think it's a great continuation of some of the points that you guys are making. Maybe any additional tricks, especially for folks that are a little more resistant. Jenny said, would love to learn about how you have built buy-in from quote unquote old dogs who are resistant to new automation. And I think that's a great point. I think many of you have talked about the successes and when it's worked. What happens if you're coming up against somebody who's a little bit more resistant?
Yeah, I think this is where Hal's recommendation about content creation, for example, is really key.
Yeah.
For example, solving a pretty large problem right now at Reddit, and it's taking, even to build a coalition, it took us about 6 months. And we did that through the framework of decks. And I would say we had several old dogs in this situation where, they saw things their way and only their way as the biggest problem. And And we were trying to identify the need for a foundation. And we had to really bring it back down to what's in it for me and what do they care about? So each executive that we're working with has a very different interest, even if we all have the same common goals at the end of the day. Surprisingly, very different interests. And so every set of content we're creating to try to get buy-in for our messaging is specific to them. What's in it for you? Why do you care? And really keeping it specific to that message, and not and here's the 80 other things that we think this will help or solve for. Just eliminate that. If they don't care about it, even if you see it as value add, I think that's where that sort of dance comes in with the old dogs. Just get right to the point with them. What do they want to see, and how will what you're doing solve it for them?
I think also one of the areas where what I've used is, I'm not a traditional, I'm not in sales, but I work with a ton of people that are in sales. There are a ton of people that are way better at persuading and showing the value of certain things. So I really, I look for the people that are above the curve, like not above the curve, but on the other side of like leaning into the new, leaning into the things that are different, and working with them to bring them to show what are all the really great features of these things, how you can leverage them from your team, and helping them sell it to their leaders, helping them sell it to the people that are kind of, stuck in their ways of being like, hey, look at what we can do. Look at the things that it's saving me. And actually having them sell it for you has also really helped me.
I love that. It kind of ties back to the multiplier theme. When you're doing this work, you're so often working across the org and finding your champions, your change agents, and people that can be a multiplier for you. And those are also people who can speak to the value of automation and the projects that you're trying to work on. I love that recommendation. It's great. I will say Hal, go ahead. I did want to make a call out. We're starting to get at that 10-minute for Q&A. Got a couple great questions on the docket to share, but if you have any other questions for our wonderful panelists, go ahead and start inputting those to the chat, and we'll start to transition to Q&A. But Hal, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, Katherine, you put it way more eloquently than I would if I would just said peer pressure works really well. And that's where it's getting a lot of the other peers of whoever you're trying to convince to also get into it. And I think that's where you just hope that the company culture is other people, maybe the old dog is more of a minority, hopefully. But if everyone else is into the other idea, then you kind of just get consensus that way. And I think there's a little bit there where with automation, in some ways you can make it flexible, but in other ways you also want to kind of make it like, well, we're not going to create 5 different ways to do it, right? And like an example was the approvals process I put together, and there's a couple old dogs just wanted an email for their approval because that's the way they're used to it. And it's like, well, I think everyone here at Trey really likes to use Slack. So we were trying to convince an old dog to, get onto the Slack bandwagon and, have those dynamic messages in Slack. And that was just one example where I was thinking about trying to get old dogs into it. And the other thing I would throw into is crawl, walk, run. Something you think one of the other panelists mentioned is a really good way, where I think they're afraid of the running with the automation where things get overly automated. And I think a approach like crawl, walk, run is a really helpful way to say, well, let's just, we can all agree that this one thing is really annoying to do. So let's just do that a little bit, create like a gap for a review. And then once you review it, then you click the OK button, and then the automation continues to run afterwards. I think approaching it that way is another way to help the folks that are not so inclined with automation to kind of get on the other side of it.
That's great. I'm going to hop over to the chat, and I'm going to field a question. This is from Rana, and this is to everybody, so just chime in as you see appropriate. Do you have in-house automation solution, or do you use automation tools out there? What kinds of automation tools do you use? I work for RoboCorp, which provides automation solution based on open source technology. And so I'm keen to know what kinds of solutions you're using. So I've heard we got some notes about tech stack, and we've been throwing out additional kind of tools like lucidchart and even something like good old PowerPoint slide decks and Google Slides. But I guess it's a question around tech stack and what you're using.
Well, I'll just go with, I think if you are a Salesforce house, I think Salesforce has a lot of really great automation, really simple automation, and you can complexify it as well. There are certain aspects of it. I think that, when you're looking at lead routing, sometimes you don't get it's good for some of it, but then if you want to expand it, looking at something like a lean data or a tray can help for it. It just kind of depends on what you're trying to do and how complex it is. I think, again, with the automation, the most important piece is that documentation, so that you're able to then go in, and if you need to change a node within it, like, you don't have to look at the entire thing, or you have that information of what else is going to be affected by that.
Yeah, we are building a lot of our automation directly on top of Salesforce right now, where we're building automation that transcends Salesforce. We're leaning into a tray to help us handle, especially as we are dev light, making sure that we have point and click solutions that our teams can manage to build these integrations across platforms and automate some of the manual work that's being done between teams. Yeah.
I'm completely indoctrinated, so take what I say with a grain of salt. I use Tray for everything, as no surprise to anyone else, I'm sure. One of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of like where to put the automation, I think Salesforce is extremely powerful in a lot of ways, and they're very specific, or for a lot of scenarios where it's when this happens, do this one thing, and it only lives in Salesforce. That's something that I just try to lean into, just general Salesforce workflows. I personally hate Process Builder in Salesforce because that's a pain, and I get a lot of error emails. And then I think one of the things that I've seen in my time, especially at Tray, is when the automation gets a little bit more complex, it might be something that I build in Salesforce because it only lives in Salesforce. And then someone would then ask me, hey, like, can I get this in Slack now? And you're like, but I built it in Salesforce. And so that was one of those situations where, for me, at least, it's been a lot easier to just build everything in Tray, knowing that if I ever need to go beyond and integrate this into Outreach or Slack or Jira, then it's just something that I can easily add another node, as opposed to trying to re-architect my original automation, which has happened to me enough times at Tray that by default I just choose Tray. But again, I'm indoctrinated, so take what I say at face value.
Hal, question for you, and not to put you on the spot, but how often do you reuse your automation that you've built within Tray? Like, for example, like sometimes when you're utilizing automation with whatever you're using, whatever you're creating it, like sometimes it's applicable and you can reuse it. And have you bumped into that and utilizing that a lot within your time there?
It's definitely something that I try really hard to do. I think sometimes it feels it's more like style points that I'm trying to go for, where if I can reuse it, then that's something I ideally want to do. So I think, very specifically, the way I try to do that is make a lot of my workflows callable workflows, so that you can just tap into it. It's almost kind of like the way if you were to design Salesforce like Apex and triggers, it's trying to create the Apex methods modular enough to be able to keep calling it from various triggers. So in that same way, I try to think of that. I think another way to call it is object-oriented programming. So it's trying to just imagine that like this is a service that I'm creating, and I can try to tap into that service as often as I can. So by doing that, that helps me reuse workflows if I can, if there's a way for me to try to reuse it.
All right, y'all, we've got one last question to round out our time together. This is coming from George, and it's got a little bit of a preamble / some context. So I'm just going to go ahead and read. Some team members are resistant to adopting an automation first mindset, since for them, they've always been customer first, and that's mission critical for them. How would you frame and bring both automation first and customer first together in a cohesive way to accelerate the adoption internally, while also being well received by those folks who perceive customer first to be first?
A great question.
Mhm.
I think that they don't have to be mutually exclusive, that the two are of the same shared goal. And so what I found is, if I can find the thread between why automation might slow down a customer journey, for example, then there's a problem there where we've not identified of how to solve it yet. And so really understanding what is the impact to the customer journey or customer first, where your automation might be putting that at risk, and then taking that risk and finding that root problem and being able to find a happy path that automates the manual work of the teams or the burden that is carried by not having this automation internally, and also solving for your customers' needs at the same time. I think it's okay to go into any automation mindset conversation thinking customer first, and then solve from there.
Catherine or Hal, did you have any reactions or response for George?
Definitely agree with Jamie in the fact that I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. They are what you're trying to do with your automation, thinking about what your customer is, like that customer first experience, or thinking about, who the customer is, what they're trying to get out of, like answering those questions, and then looking at how to automate, which pieces to automate, which pieces that you do need to actually have a live human touch to, is critical. And just knowing who your customers are. So I think that they're not, they're indirectly related from that aspect.
And to me, I'm trying to think of examples of when those might be at odds. And I would think that, like, yeah, to that point, it's not mutually exclusive, but when a stakeholder might have that opinion, the only thing I can really think of is like when it comes to like emails, because most people hate emails. And I think it's one of those things where like, I'm trying to use a specific example where it might be like an SDR team. It's like, well, we want customers first. We want to like, generate all our own emails. And that might be a very well and fine, opinion and objective. And I think there's still room for automation there, right? Like it doesn't mean we have to build an automation that sends out emails, but more of an automation that helps curate information so that it can be input into an email. Maybe using automation to provide the SDR with job title and company name, and maybe like just more information that they can tap into so that it can help craft a better email. So that's the only kind of example that I can really come up with, but it sounds like it also might be use case by use case too.
Yeah. Well, again, just filled with gratitude and very thankful for this wonderful discussion between the three of you. Thank you for joining us. This has been wonderful. And thanks to everybody who's joining us from that black box way out there. Thank you for having such a great, just a great discussion. And we'll wrap up here. So thanks again for joining. And in case our panelists start seeing, we've got a couple thank yous coming in from the chat. But yeah, I'll see you guys on the other side. Thanks again.